We come to this morning to Matthew chapters 8 and 9. I'll say just a little bit here to put this section in context. I believe when you read Matthew carefully, you see that this is not just a hit or miss collection of materials, but that there's a plan and structure to it. And one of the things that we have him doing is first giving a broad view, a summary view, and then going into some detail, bringing out various aspects of the thing that he had summarized first. And that's what we have in this beginning portion of the personal ministry of Jesus, or the ministry in Galilee, I should say. In chapter 4, verses 23 through 25, he is given the broad view of the ministry of Jesus. He went about in Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all manner of disease and all manner of sickness among the people. So there was preaching and teaching, and there was the performing of these miracles, and miracles of healing especially are mentioned, although that was not the only kinds of miracles that were performed. But in what follows, we have then a sampling. The Sermon on the Mount is a sampling of the teaching of Jesus that he was doing, the gospel of the kingdom, the call to repentance on the basis of the fact the kingdom is at hand, the good news about the kingdom is brought out, the righteousness of the kingdom in chapters 5 and 6 and 7. Chapters 8 and 9 do a similar thing with regard to the miracles. After the illustrations of the teaching of Jesus, now there are illustrations of the miracles of Jesus. That's what we have in Matthew chapters 8 and 9, almost to the end of chapter 9, at least to chapter 9, verse 34. Then chapter 9, 35 is a passage that just about repeats those verses, the verse I read back in chapter 4, the summary, which is almost like waving a flag saying, here's a new section, a new development of things, and so summarizing and then carrying it on from there, just as he did in this first section. The thing I want us to see is Matthew's portrait of Jesus, his witness to Jesus, the witness of Jesus concerning his teaching, chapters 5, 6, and 7, and now the witness of Matthew to Jesus, the sampling of these miracles that Jesus performed. We don't want to read this just as such a commonplace thing that we've heard it all before, that it does not register the tremendous things that are being said. If I were teaching a class, children, or whatever in this, what I would want to do is try to let Matthew make his own impression here. The impression he wants to have made concerning Jesus. He brings Jesus into confrontation with his readers, and that ought to make an impression on their minds. And not looking for whatever lesson we can somehow twist this different sections of this to teach about the Christian life and that sort of thing, but just trust the book. The teacher ought to try to get out of the way as much as possible and just let the book do the work. And the better understanding we can get of it, of course, the better equipped we'll be to do that. So we're going to look at this, and the first of these miracles is the healing of a leper. Now notice that the first point, the faith that this leper brings to Jesus when he comes. He came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. So this man comes with faith, and faith in the power of Jesus. So I would, he got that from somewhere. I would guess that he's either seen some of the things that Jesus has done, heard some of the teaching, or perhaps as the word has gotten passed around, he's at least got the report of it that way. And he comes with a faith. If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. He knows the only thing at issue here is whether it is within the will of Jesus to do this. There's no question of ability. And I think this is a good passage to remember. This is kind of an incidental sidelight, but when people say, they're expecting all these things to happen today, especially the charismatics and the Pentecostals, and they say, don't you believe God's got the power to do this? Yeah, he just doesn't do everything. He doesn't will to do everything that he can do. And this leper is able to make that distinction. If thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. That's a lot to say, because leprosy, and here's the thing that ought to make this stand out, leprosy was a disease that just made your whole body just rot away, and there was an uncleanness. They were isolated, and they went about saying unclean, unclean, and people had to make way, and they were just isolated because of this uncleanness that they had according to the law, this ceremonial uncleanness. So Jesus responds then with this tremendous miracle, and he stretched forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be thou made clean. And straightway, that word indicates the miraculous nature, the instantaneous thing that happens here. His leprosy was cleansed. So I think the thing that needs to stand out here is just this tremendous thing that happens. Man, Matthew doesn't point this out, and maybe I ought not to, but I think it's Luke account says the man was full of leprosy. He was at an advanced stage. So he's just eaten up with it, and Jesus reaches out and touches this one that was unclean, and his leprosy just vanished, and he was cleansed. This is the thing that Matthew wants to impress with his readers. And then Jesus' directions to the leper, his instructions. He said to him, see thou tell no man. He was trying to go from city to city teaching. And Mark brings this out, and this man disobeyed. He went and told everybody. Really, how could he not? He did anyway, and that brought such crowds that Jesus couldn't go into the cities anymore. So this excitement over miracles is something that would interfere with his plans, and perhaps would breed false ideas about what he was all about. And so I think that explains this. See thou tell no man. The faith healers of today, they tell everybody to testify. He said, see thou tell no man. But go, show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them. Now that refers to Leviticus 13 and 14. The leper was unclean. People, they had to live in isolation. And so when there was a cleansing of the leper, he had to come to the priest, and the priest is given this manual in Leviticus 13 and 14. It tells him how to recognize these skin diseases and how to recognize when it's cleansed. And so this man was to go to the priest, and then he would have the testimony of the priest that he really was cleansed. Remarkable thing. These leading people that sometimes were opposed to Jesus, they're going to give the testimony that testifies to the miracle that has been performed here. All right. Then there's a lot of attention given here to this healing of a centurion's servant. The centurions in the Bible get good marks. Cornelius was one. I think there was one at the cross that made a confession about Jesus. They just seemed to come out good. They must have had people of character in that position. It was, I think, a captain, a commander of 100 men. Well, and when he was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion beseeching him and saying, Lord, my servant lieth in his house, sick of the palsy, grievously tormented. Matthew really gives the shortened version. When you read Mark and Luke on these miracles, there's a whole lot there that's not in Matthew. And I am tempted to say that we ought to just leave it out, because when we put in those details, then I'm afraid what happens is that we lose the focus that Matthew wants. And what we want to try to do when we study Matthew is to study Matthew and let his book do the work and make the impression that he wanted made. So Jesus says, I will come and heal him. And then you've got this remarkable expression of faith on the part of this centurion. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I'm not worthy that thou shouldst come under my roof, but only say the word, and my servant shall be healed. Just say the word. Now, that's remarkable. Speak the word, my servant shall be healed. That's all you have to do. For I also am a man under authority, having under myself soldiers. And I say to this one, Go, and he goeth; to another, Come, and he cometh; and to my servant, Do this, and he doeth it. I understand what it is to be in authority and to be under authority. And so I give orders, and things are just done. He explains the sense in which he applies that to himself. He's got these under him that carry out his orders. And so he expects that Jesus just be able to speak the word and it will be done. I mean, this is ascribing God-like characteristics. This is what God did at the creation. Let there be light, and there was light. And this man comes to Jesus and expresses that kind of faith in his authority and power. I believe maybe we ought to connect that to the reference to authority there in chapter 7, verse 28 and 29. The thing that just stunned the crowd was the authority with which Jesus spoke. And this man has seen some things in Jesus that make him understand this authority that he has at such a high level as this, that all he has to do is just give the word and the thing's going to be done. What is it that explains this unworthiness to come into my house? Who is this fellow?
A Roman soldier.
A Roman soldier, and that makes him what?
A Gentile.
A Gentile. So the whole key to this story is the fact that this man is not a Jew but a Gentile. You've got some things in connection with Cornelius, who was also a Roman centurion in the army, according to Acts 10 verse 1. Some things in connection with that explain some things about this. For example, in Acts 10, 27, 29, when Peter comes, he says, You know that it is an unlawful thing for someone of my nation to come to the house of one of another nation. And then when he went to Jerusalem after the conversion of Cornelius, in chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, he was called on the carpet by the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem, and they said, You've gone into the house of a Gentile man and did eat with him. And so that's what is involved here. I'm unworthy, and there's a humility and there's a mighty faith that is expressed, and an understanding of the power of Jesus' word. Now, Jesus says, as he first, not just to this man, but to whoever is there. When Jesus heard it, he marveled and said to them that followed, Verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. I've not found a faith like this, even among the Israelites. And he sees this as significant, as the foreshadowing of coming events. Chapter 8, verses 11 and 12. And I say unto you that many shall come from the east and the west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The margin points out that the word sit down is recline. This is the word that's used when it says they sit down at the table. Really, they recline. They leaned on an elbow at a low table. So this is like a banquet that we're dealing with here. He'll recline at table with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, but the sons of the kingdom shall be cast forth into that outer darkness. There shall be the weeping and the gnashing of teeth. Well, by the time the Gospel of Matthew was written, actually put in writing, this had happened. And the book of Acts shows us how in city after city after city, the Jews in the synagogue were mostly rejecting the gospel, and it was the Gentiles that were accepting of Jesus as the Christ and obeying the gospel. And so when this Gentile man comes to Jesus and expresses this kind of faith, he sees this as a foreshadowing of these things that are going to happen. A couple of comments on this. One is that this language just goes back to Old Testament prophecy about the nations, people from everywhere coming into the kingdom. Isaiah 2 through 4, and so on. Everybody will get a copy of these transparencies, so I won't go through all the passages, but several passages in Isaiah talk about coming of those from east, west, everywhere, and not just Jews, but Gentile people who would come. And sit at the banquet table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's occurred to me for a long time that this idea of coming and sitting at down with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom, that the background for explaining that are these passages that talk about various people that ate at the king's table. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7, David permitted Mephibosheth, this son of Saul, to come and to eat at his table. Well, that was a high honor. He offers later on, chapter 19, verse 28, this, I've forgotten the man's name now, fellow that helped him when he was running from Absalom. But he offers to come and I will sustain you. Now, it doesn't talk about eating at the king's table, but that's really what that amounts to. And then other passages later on, the expression, those that eat at the king's table, is involved. So this high privilege, sitting at table in the kingdom of God, along with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then in contrast to that, the ones that you would really expect to be there are not there. The Jews, sons of the kingdom, the heirs of all of that, the natural heirs, their rejection of the Messiah, they are cast out where there will be weeping, the outer darkness away from the banquet hall, and the weeping, the sorrow, and the gnashing of teeth, the grinding, the agony that would be of those who've lost the privileges of the kingdom. So then, all that's left there in verse 13 is this word to the centurion, in which, just as the man said, with a word, Jesus heals his servant. Go thy way as thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee. And the servant was healed in that hour. What I would like for us to do, as much as possible in our classes, is just pile up these passages. I'm putting a lot of emphasis on details here, and these are important things. This explanation about the Gentiles is something that is important to the understanding of the kingdom, and that's a main thrust here. But one of the things that I think we need to do is just, Matthew in chapters 8 and 9 has just piled up these examples of healing. And so the marvelous thing, you touch a leper and the leprosy vanish, and then just speak a word at a distance, and this man's servant be healed. Marvelous things. The accumulation of all of it will have its effect. And then he goes into the house, and in chapter 8, verse 14 through 17, there's the healing of Peter's mother-in-law who's lying sick of a fever. This is not somebody who's come to him. This is a friend, one of his closest disciples, someone in his family. And so Jesus takes the initiative. He touched her hand, the fever left her, and she arose and ministered unto him. I think it's worth pointing out here that the completeness of this cure. You know, we have fevers, very bad fevers, and we get over them. But then what?
You're wiped out.
Yeah. This woman was cured instantaneously, completely, and is able to go about her normal functions. So that is another thing, just the accumulation of all these things. Then a summary of the various healings that were taking place, verses 16 and 17, and all of it is said to be the fulfillment of that which was spoken through Isaiah the prophet, saying, Himself took our infirmities and bare our diseases. And that's a reference to Isaiah 53:4, the suffering servant, who it's applied here to the removal of the diseases by means of the healings, but in the original text, the idea was Him bearing this burden that He bore, that was involved in that as he went among people and bore their diseases and all the things that was involved in the suffering of the servant. Okay, now the next passage is a little bit strange. It seems clear that in chapters 8 and 9 there's just a heaping up of miracles, but here we come to this passage that is kind of a digression from that, so it appears. But I think that's just on first appearances. I'm going to have to skim over this, but I think this is not really so much a digression from the main thing of presenting miracles and piling up the miracles. In the first place, verse 18 is the introduction to the next miracle, which is the stilling of the storm at sea. Verse 18 shows how he came to be out there on the sea in the first place. So that becomes the introduction and the background for the explanation of this next miracle. So this all is connected with miracles. Now when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave commandment to depart unto the other side. Now, I think that by putting some things together, we can see why. I mean, he sees the multitudes. You think, well, go, teach them. Well, no, get away from them. There is more than one occasion where Jesus needed to get away from the crowds, and especially to get his disciples away from the crowds, because of the bad influence the crowds were going to have on him, on his disciples especially. In chapter 14, verse 22, it says that after the multiplying of the loaves and the fishes to feed the 5,000, that Jesus constrained his disciples to get in the boat and cross the sea, get away from that. Well, that's strong language. And we don't really have an explanation of it in Matthew, just as we don't have an explanation of why he wanted to get away from these crowds here. But John gives us the explanation. We see what was happening among these crowds in John chapter 6, verse 15 and following. After they saw that miracle of the multiplying of the loaves and fishes, they were ready to, let's take him by force and make him king. The Passover was at hand. Take him up there to Jerusalem, crown him, put him on the throne right here now. Start the overthrow of the Romans. No wonder he constrained the apostles. Get in the boat, get away from here. I think you've got a similar thing here. If you can assume that, then these things that don't really deal with the miracles explain why he was getting the disciples in the boat. The crowds were not understanding what he was all about. Isaiah had talked about in this passage the taking the infirmities, bearing the diseases. They didn't have any notion of that kind of a Messiah. And so I think these two examples in verses 19 through 22 give us illustrations of what was present there in the crowd. This superficial idea of the Messiah that they had. And that being the case, then this just weaves right into the pattern of two chapters that pile up the miracles and are giving illustrations of miracles. But here's one illustration. There came a scribe and said unto him, Teacher, I will follow thee whithersoever thou goest. Gets excited when he sees the marching soldiers and the trumpets blowing and all that, the gleam of the metals in the sun. Boy, I want to join up. Jesus wants him to see the foxholes, the mud, the forced marches. And Jesus said unto him, The foxes have holes, and the birds of the heaven have nests, but the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. You're going to follow me wherever I go? Understand what that means. What you're putting yourself in for. Then another illustration. Another of the disciples, and I think this must be used in the broad sense in which... Yeah, just everybody that was there would be referred to as disciples in one sense of the word, but not in the deepest sense. Verse 21, Another of the disciples said unto him, Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father. But Jesus saith unto him, Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. First, I'm going to follow you too, but first, well, Jesus says, first nothing. The kingdom's more important than anything you've got to do. Anybody can tend to that. Leave the dead to bury their own dead. So, and obviously he's using dead in two different senses here.
Dead in sin.
Dead in sin. Anybody can tend to this, but you've got more important business to do. So there was this superficiality, and people excited by what they were seeing, and especially the miracles. They would be excited about that. And what this does then is explain what he's getting his disciples away from when he wants them to get in this boat and go.
Does he think they were
caught up in some ego trip. They were like little heroes because of their association with him. And
I don't know. It could be something like that. Anyway, I mean, he's not just turning them away completely. He wants everybody to count the cost and see what he wants them to be willing to pay the price. But that's the thing they need to understand, and he's putting that out there for them, and incidentally, it shows us the shallowness of the conception that a lot of people had, and makes this kind of a parallel to what happened after the feeding of the 5,000. So there's a long explanation to make in order to say that this sort of weaves into this pattern. Okay, then this tremendous miracle, and when he was entered into a boat, his disciples followed him. I'm at 23 to 27. We've got this calming of the storm at sea. And behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the boat was covered with the waves, but he was asleep. And they came to him and woke him, saying, Save, Lord, we perish. And he saith unto them, Why are you fearful, O ye of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Stop that. Rebuked, as if this was something that's working against his purpose. Rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? It's no wonder that they would say a thing like this, because the thing that happens here is something that the Old Testament is just full of. Psalm 107, 23 to 30 is probably the best illustration. It talks about the raging of the sea and the calming of the sea, but it says Jehovah does it. Jehovah does it. And there are other passages that talk about this control over nature that the God of heaven has. And so they see this man doing the thing that God himself is said to do so frequently in the Old Testament, and manifesting this God-like control over nature. He said, what kind of a man is this? This is the impression that's made over them.
It also shows, it links back to his getting them away from the crowds because of the superficiality. It shows that they're superficial still at this point.
Yeah.
Because they're amazed that he's got the capacity to do something they should have already seen.
Yeah, and they keep being like this, and sometime they should get past amazement. But there just has to be a deepening of their understanding of who this is. But I think these reactions of people are one of the important things to this. We want, when we tell this story of the calming of the sea, people ought to ask, who is this? He could do such things. Cleansing a leper with a touch, speaking a word and healing a servant from a distance. And now this raging sea calmed with a rebuke and order given to it, and showing that he's in charge of those things. Now, in the next, this casting out of this demon in Gerizim, or Gadara, I guess. There are some versions that some of the texts say Gerasenes instead of Gadarenes. It's a textual matter that I don't want to get into here. Doesn't make any difference. But there's a whole lot more about this story that we know that's not in Matthew. Mark's got it, Luke's got it, and they tell you a whole lot more. And I'm fearful of trying to paint the whole picture, because we may get the whole story and then lose the emphasis of every one of them. So we won't do that. But this was just the others, I think, mention a demoniac, just one wild fella, and evidently one must have been more outstanding, the spokesman perhaps for the two. But Matthew says 2 possessed the demons, coming out of the tombs, exceeding fierce, so that no man could pass that way. He does want us to understand that these were wild people, and people just pretty soon realized they didn't want to take that route when they were going anywhere. No man could pass by that way. And behold, they cried out, saying, What have we to do with thee, thou Son of God? Art thou come hither to torment us before the time? And so there's a recognition in these supernatural beings, a recognition of who Jesus was. When other people are saying, what kind of man is this? This demoniac knows who this is. So it takes supernatural knowledge, but Jesus is going to communicate that. In His words, in His works, He communicates this understanding of who He is, so that any human being can have that supernatural knowledge by the revelation that comes through these means, know who He is. So then they ask to be sent into this herd of swine, and I guess maybe they think that they can avoid the torment by going into this herd of swine. They asked that, and He permits it. He said unto them, Go. And they came out and went into the swine. Behold, the whole herd rushed down the steep into the sea and perished in the waters. And they that fed them fled and went away into the city and told everything, and what was befallen to them that were possessed with demons. And behold, all the city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw Him, they besought Him that He would depart from their borders. I probably haven't spent enough time on this, but all of us need to spend enough time to get sort of an impression of what stands out in this story in Matthew. And what it seems to me is this reaction of the people to all this. Some of the other accounts, they give a whole lot more attention to the man, the wildness of him, and then the changed condition, the marvelous miracle. None of that in Matthew. The only thing about that is the latter part of verse 33, what was befallen to them that were possessed with demons. So maybe the thing that is to stand out here is the people in that area wanting Jesus to leave.
Cost.
Yeah, rather have the pigs than Jesus, rather have the salvation of the pigs than the salvation of the people. And Jesus doesn't force Himself on anybody. I mean, people say leave, He'll leave. And He does. And when they do that, then just think what that could have meant to have Him there in their presence. See, this man was just transformed, and they didn't want that. There were other things, evidently, that they were more interested in.
You were referring to supernatural knowledge or understanding of who He was and what He was doing, but in reality, it was no different now than it was then. All they needed was education. It didn't take a supernatural. It didn't take an act of a supernatural act for them to understand who Jesus was. They just needed to understand who the demon was and the relationship between the two.
Yeah, but I mean the fact that the demons knew Him when human beings did not. So these supernatural beings did. They knew who He was. I can't get into a long discussion of demonology, but there are a couple of things that seem to me to simplify who these were. Satan is called the prince of demons, chapter 12, verse 24 and verse 26. In another passage, chapter 25, verse 41, it speaks of the devil and his angels. I think that probably explains this. The angels that joined the rebellion of Satan, the fallen angels, those who joined the rebellion of Satan, are involved in this. You don't read about demon possession in the Old Testament. It's something that is manifest especially in connection with the coming of Christ. And I think that maybe it's especially a response to what was about to happen with this, that the devil gathers his greatest forces and there's this great confrontation with the Messiah when He appears. And then, in my opinion, Jesus defeats the devil in this, and at the cross brings down principalities and powers, according to Colossians 2:15. And I really doubt that it was something that survived the age of the apostles when people had the power to deal with these things. But I can recommend maybe some things to read, but I think I've got to move on and not do anything more with that. And when I've said that, I've said about all I can anyway. It's a difficult subject. Okay, well, we're running out of time. If I don't get enough on the tape on a few of these things, I'll put it on the tape afterwards. I want us to see the whole in the class, and for teachers to be getting an impression of what they want to try to accomplish in the teaching of this. Probably in the classes you may have 2 lessons to deal with chapter 8 and 9 anyway. In chapter 9, verses 1 through 8, there's a healing of a paralyzed man. And Jesus comes at this in a different way than he had. They brought him a man sick of the palsy, lying on a bed. Matthew shortens this up. He doesn't say anything about how hard it was to get him there, how the crowd filling the house. They brought him this, however distance it was, whatever distance it was, and then they can't even get to him. Well, that doesn't stop them. What do? Yeah, the other accounts will tell us they put him, tore through the tiles of the roof and lowered him. So it's no wonder it says Jesus saw their faith. And Jesus, seeing their faith, said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, be of good cheer, thy sins are forgiven. I don't know why he goes at this in this way. In other teaching that he does, he makes it very clear that that suffering is not inevitably connected with some sin that a person has committed. Luke 13:3 is an example of that, and John 9 is another example, the first few verses of John chapter 9, where he teaches that you see somebody suffering, you can't just assume that that's a great sinner because he's suffering greatly. And it may be, I can think of a couple of options. It may be that that this was an instance where Jesus knew that this suffering was somehow connected with the man's sin. But the other thing was that he may have just seen that this is what the man wanted. That this was the thing that was most important to him. And so he responds to the unspoken request that the man makes. But that has some repercussions. Verse 3, And behold, certain of the scribes said within themselves, this is what they were thinking, this man blasphemes, claiming to forgive sins. That's the prerogative of God alone. Well, that gives Jesus an opportunity to show the relationship between these claims that he makes, his words, and his works. I haven't done anything to explain the miracles and why he worked them. But this is one of the passages that focuses on that. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, Wherefore think ye evil in your hearts? For which is easier to say, Thy sins are forgiven, or to say, Arise and walk? Well, one of these things would be about as difficult as the other. If he could do one, he could do the other. If there was any distinction to be made, it would be easier to say, Thy sins be forgiven thee. I mean, who's going to know? Yeah. And the other, if there's no effect when you say, take up your bed and walk, if there's no effect, then they quickly see that there was nothing to this claim. So, if anything, that would be the harder. And so, he goes on, verse 6, But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath authority on earth to forgive sins, then saith he to the sick of the palsy, Arise, and take up thy bed, and go into thy house. And he arose and departed to his house. That you may know that the Son of Man hath authority on earth to forgive sins. He does the thing that was equally hard to do, and says, take up your bed and walk. At least as hard, if not harder, to say that, and the man does it. Now this is demonstrable. It's something they can see. Forgiveness of sin, you can't tell. That's something that has to do with the record in heaven. You don't see whether that's taking place in an individual or not, but you can see the other. You can tell whether this man's paralyzed and whether he now has the ability to take up his bed and his pallet that they brought him on and walk or not. And so the thing out there in the visible world that is testable becomes the proof of the claim that he makes with regard to something that's not testable. And so it seems to me this is one of the important passages that helps us to understand the words and the works. Jesus showed himself to people. The Son of God comes appearing to people, and he revealed himself in two ways, with words and with works. And this helps us to see the relationship between the words and the works. Our time is running out. Let me skip to the end of this, and then I want to, I'll just put some more material on some of this on the tape. And Thursday night we'll go to chapter 10 and do 10 and 11, if I can possibly get that much covered on Thursday night. But I want you to notice, after this, there's some teaching that Jesus does that shows something about his mission. And I think the way that fits in here is that miracles have to be explained. They're great displays of power, and there are certain assumptions that can be made. But if they're really going to be understood, there has to be some words with it. And so he talks about his mission. Come not to call the righteous but sinners. Some definition of his miracles. Come as a physician. And then this about the fasting and the bridegroom and the sons of the sons of the bride chamber and all that. Then verses 18 to 26, a double miracle. The story of both of these is intertwined and climaxing with a resurrection from the dead. And then there's the giving sight to two blind men, and then a dumb, speechless demoniac is brought to him. And this section, look at the way this section ends, verse 33 and 34. And when the demon was cast out, the dumb man spake. And the multitudes marveled, saying, It was never so seen in Israel. But the Pharisees said, By the prince of the demons casteth he out demons. Now that's the end of this. See, verse 35 is going to be another summary statement and get us into another major development in Matthew. But this is the end of this section. And this section ends the way the other one did. In chapter 7, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the crowd was stunned at the authority with which he spoke. He did not speak as the scribes. Now you've got all these miracles. He spoke with authority, and now he does all these things. Boy, that explains a lot as he used these miracles to show who he is. And so this section ends with this crowd reaction. You can pick up details in other places in these two chapters where you see these crowd reactions, but it ends this way. It was never seen, never so seen in Israel. That was the impression that this made. And so, in a couple of places it emphasized the authority. He spoke with authority. Now he does these things that show authority, that demonstrate authority. And they say it was never so seen in Israel. But the other thing, there's more reaction than that. But the Pharisee said, By the prince of the demons casteth he out demons. And that's going to tell us a lot. That although there are crowds of people that are being impressed in a favorable way, and there'd be a gradual understanding, at least on the part of his disciples, about who this Jesus is, but there's some out there that are just determined that they're not going to believe in him no matter what. And look at how hard their hearts are. How hard their hearts are. There is nothing that Jesus did that so much showed that he was against Satan as casting out of demons. I mean, the other things may have their implications, but right on the surface of this, it smacked of Jesus being against Satan, coming to destroy the works of the devil. And they take this thing, which most showed that he was against Satan, and they say, oh, he can do that because he's in league with Satan. He's doing it by the power of Satan. I'll tell you, when somebody is that perverse, there's just not much you can do for him. And that's going to explain a lot about the way this story will end up at the cross.
I wonder how much of it was related to the fact that they're not believing it or wanting to believe it or being impressed by it, but seeing so many of their former followers losing them.
Yeah, you got these vested interests that blind them to see. Yeah.
John the Baptist would say it's basically time for him to step back and the Lord to come forward. And these people are wanting to stay right out.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never seen that kind. Since our time ran out on us again, before we went into very much detail with regard to all of the passages of chapters 8 and 9, I want to add as a kind of an addendum to the previous lesson a few comments on the section of material that begins at Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9. Beginning with chapter 9, verse 9, and running through verse 17, again we have interspersed within these two chapters that are devoted to bringing together a number of the miracles of Jesus as samples of his miraculous activity. We have some material that does not relate to miracles especially. And yet, I believe if we think about it, we may be able to see that it is not really so out of joint or apart from the flow as might first appear. Miracles are acts of power that may amaze people, but if they're going to be understood, some words are necessary. Now, that has been done by Jesus in connection with some specific miracles, some words that sort of connect the thing that is happening with the messianic activity and the messianic significance of his work. For example, in connection with the healing of the centurion's servant back in chapter 8 and verses 10 through 12, there is an explanation that links the event with the mission of Jesus and the messianic kingdom that is in process of being established. And then again in chapter 9, in the miracle in which he healed the paralytic that was brought to him in chapter 9 verses 1 through 8, in verse 4 through verse 6, we have words of explanation that link the miracle with who Jesus is. And the miracle is shown to be a demonstration of the authority of the Son of Man on earth to forgive sins. Well, now we have explanations of the mission of Jesus just added apart from any particular miracle. First, in verses 9 through 13, we deal with the call of Matthew and the dinner that was held at his house. In verse 9, we have once again Jesus calling one of the men who is going to be one of his chosen apostles. He finds this tax collector who is sitting at the place of toll, which means his place of business, and he saith unto him, Follow me, and he arose and followed him. It may be that that is inserted here because of what follows. The dinner that is held, that is described, verses 10 through 13, is a dinner that was held at Matthew's house. Now that's not clear from Matthew's account of it. It just mentions that Jesus sat at meat in the house. In Luke's account, it is pointed out that this was Matthew's house. Now don't be confused by the names that are given to this man. In the other accounts, in Mark and in Luke, he will be called Levi, but it is the very same man who is here called Matthew. After the call of this man, evidently Matthew uses the occasion of a dinner at his house to introduce Jesus to his friends. And so at this dinner, many publicans and sinners came and sat down with Jesus and his disciples. Now this becomes the subject of conflict again, and we begin to see more and more Not only that people are going to be amazed and that they will become believers because of the things that Jesus does, but he has enemies, and they begin to look for something to find fault with. And so they come to the disciples of Jesus, and the Pharisees ask his disciples, "Why eateth your teacher with the publicans and sinners?" They certainly would not rub elbows with publicans and sinners on an occasion such as this. But it becomes the occasion then, their criticism becomes the occasion for Jesus to make an explanation with regard to his mission in the world. In verse 12, he said, "They that are whole have no need of a physician, but they that are sick. That's why I am mingling with publicans and sinners. I come among them as a doctor may come among sick people in order to minister to them and to heal and to cure them of their soul's disease." But he comes among publicans and sinners in the spirit of a doctor who has to come to minister to the sick, but taking every precaution possible in order that he may not become afflicted with their contagion. Well, he says in verse 13, "But go ye and learn what this meaneth. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." If they had understood this statement that is made in Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6, I desire mercy and sacrifice, if they would learn what that meant, they would not be as critical as they were of his going among sinners. Sacrifice, the formalities, the external things, would just be of no value at all apart from mercy. This is the point of Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. And that was the thing that the Pharisees were missing. At the end of verse 13, Jesus says, "For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." And so this was his mission, to call the sinners to repentance. If you claim that you are righteous, then I have not come for you. And so Jesus almost seems to take them at their word. They treat themselves as righteous, so they have no need of a doctor to come and to minister unto them. And so they miss the help that he could bring to them because of the self-righteous spirit that they take. Then there's another question that follows, a question about fasting, and this comes from more friendly quarters. Then come to him the disciples of John, saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast oft, but thy disciples fast not?" This is connected with this dinner that was being held. There are some who think it may have been that the dinner was being held on one of the regular fast days among the Jews. We fast, the Pharisees fast, but why do your disciples not fast? Jesus answers then with some additional information about fasting and the way fasting ought to be seen. In the 6th chapter, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus had some things to say about fasting. When ye fast, he said, he assumed that the citizens of the kingdom would fast. He does not command them to fast. He says, when you fast, he assumes that they would. And in that place, he is speaking to them about the proper motivation in acts of service or pious acts such as fasting. You are not to make this a performance, to do it in order to be seen of men, but you're to do it unto God and with an eye on the Father. Now he adds some additional information about fasting. And I believe that the main point of verses 15 through 17 is going to be that fasting is something that is done not just artificially, not just as a formality, but it is something that is done as fits the occasion. Fasting is an expression of mourning, perhaps mourning over sin. It is a way of humbling oneself. These are the sort of connections that fasting has through the Old Testament. It is connected with humbling oneself before God, turning to God in a special way, concentrating one's attention on the seeking of certain spiritual purposes, seeking God in a special way, and concentrating upon one thing by avoiding other things. It would be a distraction. It's not the time for partying. It's the time for mourning, for humbling oneself before God. It is the time for concentrating upon certain important spiritual purposes. But it is done as fits the occasion. And so Jesus asked the question in verse 15, can the sons of the bride chamber mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and then will they fast. It is interesting that John the Baptist himself had used this imagery, Jesus as the bridegroom and himself as the friend of the bridegroom, in John chapter 3 verses 26 through 30. And so now, in effect, Jesus is saying that you don't fast at a wedding. That's a time for banqueting. As long as the bridegroom is with the sons of the bride chamber, then it would be completely out of place for them to be mourning. This is a time for celebrating and for being joyful. But he says the time will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, which is an allusion to his death and his being taken away from them as he returns to heaven. Perhaps especially with reference to the violent death. They will fast then. The sons of the bride chamber will fast at that time, and no one will have to tell them. It will be the natural circumstances in which fasting will fit in. And so that's the point. You do it when it is fitting. He gives other illustrations. No man putteth a piece of undressed cloth upon an old garment, for that which should fill it taketh from the garment, and a worse rent is made. You don't put a piece of new cloth, undressed cloth, on an old garment. The old garment will have shrunk as much as it can, but you patch the old garment with a new patch, and the new patch shrinks, and that draws it up and tears. A worse rent will be made. So this is just something that is not done. It is not fitting, not appropriate to do. In verse 17, another illustration. Neither do men put new wine into old wineskins, else the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins perish. But they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved. The old wineskins will have given as much as they can, and they will have stiffened up. So you don't put new wine that's going to ferment and expand into these old wineskins, because those old skins will have given as much as they can. They will end up bursting. You'll lose the skins and the wine. So you put new wine into fresh wineskins, and then both are preserved. This is not done. You don't put new wine in old wineskins. There are many people who have explained this as being a contrast between the old traditional ways and the new ways that Jesus brings. But I believe that is not really the point. These are all illustrations of something that is fitting, things that go together properly, and all in support of the idea that fasting is something that is done in the appropriate setting. It is not something that is done when it is not appropriate. If there's any doubt about that being the proper explanation of this, Luke adds an illustration in his account of this matter. In Luke chapter 5, in verse 39, he adds one other thing that is simply not done. No man having drunk old wine desireth new, for he saith, the old is good. He prefers the old. Well, if this is a contrast between the old traditions and the new ways that are brought by Jesus, then you've got the very opposite of what you would expect here, somebody preferring the old. No man having drunk old wine desireth new, for he saith the old is good. He will prefer the old every time. You see, these are just illustrations that are heaped up about what is appropriate, what is done, and what is not done. All in support of the idea that fasting is something done as fits the occasion, and it is not a time for fasting at circumstances that are like a wedding. That's a time for joy, a time for banqueting. Fasting will be something that will be done in times of sorrow, when it is natural to want to fast. In times where you perhaps give yourself to serious spiritual purpose, and so concentrate on that, and don't want it's not a time which is appropriate for partying and such things, but it is an appropriate time for fasting. Then we come back to some other miracles in chapter 9, verses 18 through 26, and there are two which are brought together here. I just want to make brief comment. A ruler, evidently a ruler of the synagogue, comes to Jesus and worships him and makes a request that Jesus come, and his daughter is dead. Come and lay your hand upon her and she shall live. This is a much more complex matter, as we see from the other accounts in Mark and in Luke. Actually, he sends servants. Matthew's account has him saying the things that he says through servants, as we learn from Mark and from Luke. But Matthew focuses in on the faith that this man has. When he first sins, she's not dead, she's at the point of death. But before Jesus actually reaches the man's home, the daughter has died. And so Jesus speaks some words of encouragement to him, according to Mark and Luke. And the man then has a faith that is equal to that task, or to the thing that is about to be done. And he expresses this faith that Jesus has the power to lay his hands upon his dead daughter and she would live. So Jesus goes to do this thing, and while he is on the way, this woman who had an issue of blood 12 years came behind him and touched the border of his garment, for she said within herself, if I do but touch his garment, I shall be made whole. And in the book of Leviticus, and I don't believe I've noted the passage down, I guess I'll have to leave that for you to look it up. In the book of Leviticus, it speaks of someone who has this kind of condition as being unclean. And this woman had had this for a long time, 12 years. It was an unnatural issue of blood. For 12 years she had had it. She had gone to the doctors. They couldn't do anything for her. They had taken her money, but they had not been able to do anything for her. But she has this faith as she comes to Jesus. And I think this condition of uncleanness may explain why she comes to him in the way she does. She does not want to be noticed. She says, if I just touch his garment, I'll be made whole. And so she does, in the midst of this crowd that throngs Jesus. It's the crowd is focused upon in Mark and in Luke. They are amazed that Jesus would know that anyone had touched him when everybody was touching him. But this woman had touched him in a special way. And so Jesus says, daughter, be of good cheer. Thy faith hath made thee whole. Verse 22, and the woman was made whole from that hour. And so the touch enabled the woman to be made whole. But this was not some magical thing, and I think maybe this is the reason that Jesus reveals the woman. He does not want it to be taken as some sort of magical power that lies in his clothing. He perceived that someone had touched him, that power had gone forth, and he wanted it to be known that this was a divine act that was done, that it was something that was done as an expression of the will of God, and not just something that was a matter of magic or something of that nature. So then Jesus goes on his way, and he comes to the ruler's house in verse 23, and he saw the flute players and the crowd making a tumult. These would be people that would be hired to mourn and to create a great mourning over a dead person. It was something that was commonly done among the Jews. So he says, "Give place, for the damsel is not dead, but sleepeth." Well, they laughed him to scorn. They knew, according to Luke, I believe it is, they knew that she was dead. Some people have thought that Jesus was saying she was not really dead. But Jesus just comes up, and before he sees the girl, he makes this statement that she's not dead but sleepeth. The people who have been there all the time, who have been in close contact with the situation, know that she is dead, and they laugh him to scorn, these professional mourners, when he says she's not dead but sleepeth. Jesus does not mean she is not really dead. He means that this is going to be such a temporary thing that you could hardly call it as anything more than a sleep. You could hardly speak of it as anything more than a sleep. And so he says, give place, for the damsel is not dead but sleepeth. And so they laughed him to scorn. But when the crowd was put forth, if they're going to make fun or be amused at his word, they will not witness this miracle. So he enters in, and he took her by the hand, and the damsel arose. According to the other accounts, we do see that he selected from among his disciples some who went in as witnesses. So it'll be witnessed, but the crowd that was not in sympathy with him would not get to witness this miracle. So the damsel arose, and the fame hereof went forth into all that land. And so the climax of the miracles is reached in a resurrection from the dead, and I think that may be the place where we ought to put the emphasis in our discussion of these miracles. But there are two more that are added. In verses 27 through 31, there is the healing of two blind men. I think we have to call attention to verse 27, where their faith is expressed. Two blind men followed him, crying out and saying, "Have mercy on us, thou Son of David." In their expression of faith, they give recognition that this is the Messiah. They do this by recognizing him as the Son of David. Why speak of him in that way? Well, that was a way of recognizing him as the Messiah. So these blind men have that faith. So then when he was come into the house, the blind men came to him, and Jesus saith unto them, "Believe ye that I am able to do this?" They saith unto him, "Yea, Lord." Then touched he their eyes, saying, "According to their faith be it done unto you." And their eyes were opened. And Jesus strictly charged them, saying, "See that no man know it." But people can't keep these things to themselves, and so they went forth and spread abroad his fame in all that land. Jesus didn't want to be specially known, though, as a miracle worker, and he knew that when the excitement of the people was worked up over the miracles, that as they came to him with these misconceptions of the Messiah and not understanding the miracles, that there would be just the wrong kind of an enthusiasm for Jesus as the Messiah, and for enthusiasm for him as the Messiah in the wrong sense, just as those in John chapter 6, when they saw him multiply the loaves and fishes in order to feed the multitude, that they wanted to take him by force right then and take him to Jerusalem and make him king. That's in John chapter 6 and verse 15, I believe is the verse. He did not want that kind of an excitement. And so there is a restraint on the publicity as much as is possible, but people can't keep this to themselves, and so they went forth and spread abroad his fame in all that land. Then in verses 32 through 34, there is the healing of a dumb demoniac. And as they went forth, behold, there was brought to him a dumb man, possessed with a demon. the demon possession in this case affected this man with the affliction of dumbness. He was unable to speak. And when the demon was cast out, the dumb man spake, and the multitudes marveled, saying, It was never so seen in Israel. But the Pharisees said, By the prince of the demons casteth he out demons. A couple of comments on these healings that take place here. Now, especially with reference to the healing of the blind men. In the prophecies of the Old Testament, I've listed several of these from Isaiah. Chapter 29, verse 18, chapter 32, verses 3 and 4, chapter 35, verse 5, chapter 42, verse 7, chapter 61, verse 1. In all of these prophecies, as the prophet looks forward to the Messianic age, it is said that the deaf will hear and the blind will receive their sight. Now, this is in a context in which Israel has been described as being spiritually blind, and so they did not listen to the message of Isaiah. They did not understand. But there would be a day in which the eyes would be opened and the deaf would hear. And this physical act would be the sign of the Messianic age. And so this particular miracle, the giving of sight to the blind, becomes in a special way something that links the miracle to Old Testament prophecy and shows that Jesus comes in fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Then the other thing that I wanted to point out is the reaction. This period of miracles, this collection of miracles that is given in chapters 8 and 9, ends with crowd reaction. In verse 33, the multitudes marveled, saying, It was never so seen in Israel. Now, we've had this before, the marveling over the miracles that Jesus did. In the calming of the stormy sea, chapter 8, verse 27, that ends with the men in the boat with Jesus marveling, saying, What manner of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him? And so they are amazed. And after the healing of the paralyzed man and the demonstration that makes of the authority that Jesus has to forgive sins, verse 8 says, When the multitude saw it, they were afraid and glorified God who had given such authority unto men. And so then, in the last of the miracles, in this section, we've got an expression of the amazement of the crowds. The multitudes marveled, verse 33, saying, It was never so seen in Israel. Now recall that that's the way the illustrations of the teaching of Jesus and the preaching of Jesus ended. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, the people were stunned when Jesus finished. They were astonished at his teaching, and the thing that amazed them so much was the authority with which he spoke. He spoke as one having authority and not as the scribes. And so again, the thing that has been called attention to is the authority. What manner of man is this that does such things? They marvel that God had given such authority unto men. And finally, it was never so seen in Israel. And so again, the teaching amazes the people that it was done, that it came from one having authority. And then these miracles have been a demonstration of the authority of Jesus. They've shown that he's not just talking through his hat. When he speaks as one having authority, he has authority. And the miracles demonstrate that. And the crowds begin to recognize that, and they are amazed. But, as I was pointing out in the class, there's another element. The Pharisees said, "By the prince of the demons casteth he out demons," in verse 34. And that's the way it ends. Although the crowds will be amazed, and there are many people that will be coming more and more to understand, and especially this will be true of the apostles that Jesus has chosen. Their faith will be deepened in the Messiah as God reveals him through his words and through his works to be the Messiah. But there will be some who will be so hard of heart that they will not recognize him or have any positive word to say about him. We see just how hard their hearts are when they say, "By the prince of the demons casteth he out demons." There is simply nothing that Jesus did where it just lay on the surface more evidently that Jesus that he had come against Satan, that his works were done against Satan. There was nothing that made that more obvious and more evident, I say, than the casting out of demons. So they take these miracles that made it most evident that Jesus was against Satan, and instead of recognizing that he was acting for God against Satan, they say he's done this by the power of Satan. They are simply so perverse that there would be nothing that he could do for them. Their hardness of heart was so great that there would be no way to bring them to faith. And so at the very end of this section then, we're given a little piece of information that shows us the beginning of this hardness of heart and this conflict that will show us that this story has to end at the cross. The cross casts a long shadow back over the ministry of Jesus. And we see it as it is given expression in these statements from enemies and their criticisms of him and their efforts to discredit the things that he does. It is interesting, though, that even these enemies are not able to deny that Jesus has performed miracles. Don't you know they would have delighted if they could have exposed it all as just some hoax? They couldn't do that. They could only challenge the power by which it was done. And they would say that he did it by the power of the devil. They can't challenge the fact that it was done. They challenge the power by which it was done. And so their very way of bringing criticism against Jesus and undermining his work is a way, is really testimony to the reality of the things that were done. So let me end this little addendum to our study of chapters 8 and 9 with a summary. And I think this would be good to summarize in the teaching of the various classes that we will have. The power of Jesus as it has been demonstrated in these miraculous works in chapters 8 and 9. There's power over disease. With just a touch, he can put an end to disease, even the most terrible diseases, even diseases like leprosy. He puts an end to it instantaneously. There's an instantaneous, miraculous healing. There's power over disease. There's power over nature. He can speak a few words and calm a raging storm and still these waves and the wind at sea. There's power over Satan and over the demonic world. And finally, and maybe the most climactic thing of all, he shows his power over death in the raising of this ruler's daughter in chapter 9, verses 18 through 26. A marvelous thing. Finally, the raising of the dead. And so in all of these ways, the magnificence of Jesus, the power of Jesus, the deity of Jesus is demonstrated. And so we want these things to make their own impression on the hearts of our students, the young and the old, as we study with them.